ready for a historical treasure hunt. Today we're diving deep into ancient Arabia, but not the desert we usually picture.
Right. We're going to challenge some assumptions using pre-Islamic poetry and historical records.
Ooh, sounds exciting.
Yeah, and we'll focus on something you might not expect, ostriches.
Ostriches. Now that's a curveball.
Their cultural significance tells us a lot about the region's geography.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Why are ostriches so important?
Well, in ancient Near Eastern cultures, ostriches were more than just birds.
Like what?
They were powerful symbols of wealth and status.
Oh, wow. Like a status symbol.
Exactly. Their feathers were used to decorate royal fans in ancient Egypt. They were even given as offerings to Assyrian kings.
So not your average bird.
Definitely not. They were a mark of prestige, and this is where our understanding of Arabia starts to shift.
Okay, how so?
The Arabian ostrich, sadly extinct, now thrived in the fertile Levant.
The Levant?
That's modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq.
Not exactly the desert image we usually associate with Arabia.
Exactly.
So if ostriches were so central to the culture reflected in pre-Islamic poetry and even the Quran, could these texts actually be talking about a more fertile region than we commonly think?
That's the question we're exploring. This evidence suggests that the Arabia of these texts might be quite different from the Arabian Peninsula as we know it today. It's more likely a region encompassing the fertile lands of the Levant.
Okay, so we might be looking at the wrong place entirely. And there's more to this story, right? What about pre-Islamic poetry? Does that support this idea of a more fertile setting?
Absolutely. In fact, there's a captivating story about a war horse named Nama.
Anna.
It translates to ostrich.
Oh, wow.
This horse belonged to a powerful warrior, and both its name and the tradition of decorating horses with ostrich feathers for battle were significant markers of high status.
So it's not just the presence of ostriches, but the cultural practices associated with them that suggest a different picture of ancient Arabia.
Precisely. The story of Naama, combined with the ostrich's natural habitat, strongly suggests that the poetry reflects a society more akin to the Levant than the harsh deserts we often imagine.
This is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about ancient Arabia. But what about the Quran itself? Does it describe a land that matches this more fertile Levantine image?
Yes, it does. While the Quran often uses metaphorical language, there are numerous passages that vividly describe a land of flowing rivers, abundant fruits, and lush vegetation.
So not exactly a desert.
Right. For instance, Surah An-Nam, verse 99, speaks of gardens of grapevines and date palms.
I see.
And Surah Ar-Rahman, verse 12, mentions 2 gardens with spreading branches. These descriptions resonate more with the fertile Levant than the arid Arabian Peninsula.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. So we're seeing a pattern here. Ostriches, poetry, and even the Quran are painting a picture of ancient Arabia that's more fertile and connected to the Levant than we typically assume. This is really challenging my preconceived notions.
And that's exactly what a good deep dive should do, challenge assumptions, and encourage us to explore alternative perspectives.
Well, I'm definitely on board for this exploration. But wait, there's more to uncover, right? What about the clothing and the cities mentioned in these ancient texts? Do they fit with this more fertile Levantine picture?
That's a great question, and it leads us to even more fascinating discoveries. You see, pre-Islamic poems often describe clothing made of fine fabrics, vibrant colors, and intricate embroidery. Not exactly what you expect from a nomadic desert culture where practicality rules.
So these were some stylish ancients. Tell me more about their fashion sense.
For instance, the poems mention garments adorned with silk, a luxurious material more likely to be found in a region with established trade routes and access to finer goods.
Oh, that makes sense. Silk robes don't exactly scream desert survival.
Exactly. And the poems also describe bustling cities with grand architecture, not just scattered desert tribes.
So not just simple tents.
No, this all points towards a society that's more settled, more urban, and more connected to the world beyond the desert.
So we've got the ostriches, the fertile landscapes, the fancy clothes, the impressive cities. It all paints a picture that's vastly different from what we usually imagine when we think of ancient Arabia.
Precisely. And it all points towards a location closer to the Levant, encompassing regions like Mesopotamia, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. The evidence suggests that this region, not the Arabian desert, might be the true setting for these ancient stories.
This is mind-blowing. I feel like we're uncovering a hidden chapter of history. But hold on, we've covered so much ground already, and I know there's more to come. Where do we go from here?
Well, next we'll delve deeper into the details of this alternative view, examining more evidence from pre-Islamic poetry, the Quran, and even accounts from neighboring civilizations. Get ready for a fascinating journey. It's truly remarkable how these ancient texts, when examined, closely reveal a very different picture of ancient Arabia than we typically envision.
It's like someone swapped the labels on the map. Okay, so if we're looking at the Levant as the potential setting for these texts, what other clues can we find that support this theory? We've talked about the landscape and fashion. What about their diet?
Excellent question. Both pre-Islamic poetry and the Quran mention wine, which wouldn't have been produced in the Arabian desert.
Right, you can't exactly grow grapes in the sand.
Exactly. However, the Levant was renowned for its vineyards in ancient times.
Ah, so enjoying a glass of wine wasn't just a poetic flourish, it was a reflection of their actual environment and lifestyle. Makes sense. What else can we learn from their menus?
The Quran also talks about specific agricultural practices.
Oh, like what?
For example, it mentions grains arranged in rows and gardens with fruits of all kinds.
Okay, so pretty advanced stuff.
This organized agriculture, particularly grain cultivation, is far more characteristic of the fertile plains of the Levant than the desert landscape of the Arabian Peninsula.
It's like we're piecing together a snapshot of their daily lives through these texts. Not just individual plants and animals, but their entire ecosystem and how they interacted with it. Do we see any evidence of this in the archaeological record?
Absolutely. When we look at archaeological evidence from the Levant, we find further support for this alternative view.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, there's Petra in Jordan, known for its incredible rock-cut architecture.
Oh yeah, I've seen pictures. It's amazing.
Then there's Baalbek in Lebanon with its majestic Roman temples. And of course, Palmyra in Syria, a once flourishing trade hub with impressive ruins.
Wow, so these were real cities.
These cities were centers of culture, commerce, and sophistication, exactly the kind of places described in these ancient texts.
It's fascinating to think that the Arabia of the Quran and pre-Islamic poetry might have been this vibrant, interconnected world. Bustling cities, fertile fields, a rich cultural tapestry. It's a far cry from the isolated desert image we so often associate with the region.
It really challenges the traditional narrative, doesn't it? If the origins of Islam were rooted in this more fertile cosmopolitan setting, it raises questions about how that might have influenced the development of the religion and its spread.
That's a huge question. But before we go too far down that road, let's address the elephant in the room. This theory is pretty radical, isn't it? What do other scholars and historians have to say about it?
You're right. This is a challenging perspective, and it's definitely sparked debate within academic circles.
I bet.
Some scholars are more open to exploring these alternative interpretations, while others remain firmly rooted in the traditional view.
So it's not like everyone is suddenly rewriting the history books.
Not exactly. But what's important is that these conversations are happening. We need to examine the evidence with an open mind and be willing to question our assumptions. That's what true scholarship is all about.
That's the spirit of a true deep dive. Okay, let's get back to the evidence itself. We've talked about ostriches, landscapes, food cities, archaeological findings. What other clues can we find in pre-Islamic poetry and the Quran that support this alternative view of ancient Arabia?
Well, there's some fascinating linguistic clues.
Ooh, I love a good linguistic clue.
For example, the pre-Islamic poems frequently mention specific types of trees and plants that are native to the Levant, but not found in the Arabian Peninsula.
Oh, I love this kind of detail. Give me an example.
Consider the tamarisk tree. It's a hardy tree that thrives in the salty, sandy soils of the Levant and is frequently mentioned in pre-Islamic poetry, but you won't find it in the Arabian desert.
Wow, so even the language itself points to a different geographical setting. Are there other examples like this?
Absolutely. There are also references to specific animals that are more characteristic of the Levant, like the gazelle. Gazelles are common in the Levant, but not typically found in the Arabian desert. And the gazelle is mentioned numerous times in the Quran, often as a symbol of grace and beauty.
So we're seeing a consistent pattern across multiple lines of evidence. The animals, the plants, the language, the archaeological findings, the cultural practices. It all points to a richer and more complex picture of ancient Arabia than we've traditionally been taught.
Exactly. And this isn't just about rewriting history. It's about understanding the context, the world that shaped the ideas and beliefs of the people who lived in those times. It's about getting a more complete picture.
I completely agree. But I have to admit, it's a lot to take in. What's the main takeaway here? What should our listeners be thinking about?
The key takeaway is this. Don't be afraid to question what you think you know. Be open to exploring alternative perspectives, even if they challenge your deeply held beliefs. That's how we grow and learn.
I love that. It's all about embracing curiosity and intellectual exploration. Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question.
If the Arabia of the Quran and pre-Islamic poetry wasn't the Arabian Peninsula, but rather a region encompassing the fertile lands of the Levant, how does that change our understanding of the origins and early development of Islam? That's something worth pondering.
That's a great question to leave us with. Gives our listeners something to think about as they continue their own journey of discovery. Now let's move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore even more fascinating insights and connections. This has been an incredible journey so far, but I have to imagine this alternative view of ancient Arabia raises some eyebrows. What are some of the pushbacks or counter-arguments people might have?
You're right. Anytime you challenge established narratives, there's bound to be some resistance. One common objection is that the Quran itself mentions Mecca as the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad and the center of early Islam.
Okay, so how do we reconcile that with the theory that the Arabia of these texts might actually be the Levant?
It requires looking at the history of how these texts were compiled and interpreted over time. Remember, the Quran wasn't written down all at once.
Right, it was revealed over time.
It was revealed over a period of about 23 years.
So could there have been shifts in understanding or even geographical locations during that time?
That's precisely what some scholars are exploring. They argue that the meaning of Mecca might have evolved over time. It's possible that initially it referred to a different location, perhaps even a symbolic or spiritual center, rather than a specific place on a map.
That's really interesting. So we're not necessarily saying the traditional account is wrong, but that there might be more layers to the story.
Exactly. It's about broadening our perspective and considering multiple layers of interpretation. Another counter-argument is that the Arabian Peninsula does have some fertile areas, particularly in the south, known for frankincense and myrrh. Couldn't the Quran be describing those places?
That's a fair point. But wouldn't the types of plants and animals mentioned in the Quran be different if it were talking about southern Arabia?
Precisely. The specific types of plants and animals described, as well as the agricultural practices, align more closely with the Levant than with the Arabian Peninsula's southern regions. For example, the Quran talks about gardens of grapevines, which would have been much more common in the Levant's Mediterranean climate.
So it's not just about the presence of fertile land, but the specific details that paint a more accurate picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about the cultural and linguistic clues we've discussed. The clothing, the architecture, and the language itself, they all point toward a Levantine setting.
It's like we're putting together a giant historical jigsaw puzzle. We've got pieces from pre-Islamic poetry, the Quran, and even archaeology all fitting together. What about historical records from other civilizations? Do they offer any insights?
This is where it gets even more intriguing. We have accounts from neighboring civilizations like the Romans and Prussians that describe Arabia as a land with diverse landscapes, including fertile regions. These accounts don't necessarily contradict the traditional view, but they add another layer of complexity to our understanding.
So we're not just relying on the Quran and poetry to build this alternative perspective. There's a broader historical context to consider.
Absolutely. And this brings us to an important point. History is rarely black and white. It's a tapestry woven from multiple threads, each adding to the richness and complexity of the story.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It reminds us that there's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider. But let's bring this back to our listener for a moment. Why should they care about this alternative view of ancient Arabia? What's the takeaway here?
That's a great question. Understanding the historical context in which a religion or culture emerged can have a profound impact on how we interpret its teachings and practices today.
Can you give an example of how this might play out?
Let's consider the concept of jihad, often misunderstood as solely meaning holy war. If we view early Islam as originating in a more cosmopolitan setting, like the Levant, where interaction and exchange between different cultures were commonplace, it opens up other understandings of jihad, perhaps as a broader concept encompassing personal struggle, spiritual striving, and even social justice.
That's a powerful insight. It really highlights how shifting our historical perspective can lead to a more nuanced understanding of these complex ideas. Is there anything we haven't touched on yet? Any lingering questions or points of contention?
One final point is that the Arabian Peninsula undoubtedly played a significant role in Islamic history, particularly after the Prophet Muhammad's migration to Medina. This deep dive has focused on challenging assumptions about the very early period, the setting that shaped the Quran and pre-Islamic culture. We're adding another dimension to our understanding, not trying to erase any part of the story.
It's about expanding the narrative, not rewriting it.
Exactly. History is a conversation, a continuous process of exploration and discovery. And sometimes the most exciting discoveries happen when we dare to question what we think we know.
That's the perfect way to wrap up this deep dive. We've journeyed through history, challenged assumptions, and opened up new possibilities for understanding ancient Arabia and the origins of Islam.
And as always, the journey doesn't end here. We encourage our listeners to delve deeper into the sources, explore different perspectives, and draw their own conclusions.
Who knows what other historical treasures await us when we approach the past with an open mind and a thirst for knowledge. Until our next deep dive, happy exploring.